Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. Before we get into this week's special episode, I'd like to tell you about our sponsors. Scrivener is an author's best friend. From the brainstorming phase to outlining to writing to editing and then to publishing, Scrivener offers a unique set of tools designed especially for writers. Go to getscrivener.com today and use the code HANK at checkout to receive 20% off. Your writing will thank you for it. Also, I'd like to thank Third Scribe for sponsoring the podcast. Third Scribe is the place for writers to connect with readers in a unique social setting. Go to thirdscribe.com/sign up and visit the Author Stories forums at Third Scribe also. Just click on the link in the show notes. Now on to our show. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories podcast, where we bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. My guest this week is Matthew Mather. Welcome to the show, Matthew.
Hi, Hank. Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. Matthew, I always start the show by asking people to give us a little bit of your history as to how you became a writer. What was the catalyst to you deciding to sit down and write a novel and publish it?
Well, there's a long story to that, as I imagine there's a long story behind many writers.
Yes.
I only started.
There's always a long story.
I'll try to keep it concise. I actually only started writing when I got to what I kind of judged the halfway point. You know, I got in my life. I mean, I got to when I was 40 years old. Up till that point, I'd been an entrepreneur in the technology field. So I'd started up quite a few companies, even went and raised venture capital and worked in Silicon Valley for a while down in California. And when I got to the halfway point, I thought, is this all I want to do? Or, everybody's got a novel in them, as the saying goes. So I decided to take a year sabbatical and sit down and try and write my idea of a science fiction book based on some things that I'd observed in the technology field. And the result of that was Topia Chronicles, which went on to sell at, I think it's at 90,000 copies now or something. And so that was the catalyst really for me to become a writer. And then within about a year after I published Topia, I actually quit what I was doing in my other work and just became a full-time writer.
Well, now you said that now you have had some pretty dream jobs for what a lot of people would think are dream jobs, but you still felt like you had a novel in you, huh?
Yeah, I mean, I think ever since when I was young, the only writing classes I ever took were in high school. But even back then, I kind of had I guess I liked reading. I think I'd read all the old classic science fiction, Asimov and Heinlein and all that, stuff.
Right.
I was like 12 or 13. I think I read Lord of the Rings about 4 times by the time I was 14. So there was sort of I liked stories and I liked science fiction, and there was sort of that twinkling of, it would be great to do that kind of thing. But my mom told me, you needed to. I think I talked to her about back then, just before I went to college. She said, you got to live life before you can write about it. So I thought, oh, well, I'll do something practical. So I did electrical engineering. But then when I got, after, when you get to sort of that midway point in your life, you think, is there something else that I might want to try and do? And so that, I had worked, I worked in the technology field. I've worked in technology transfer and helping build companies. And there's a whole list of technologies that I can list off. But yeah, that's kind of the path I took.
That's awesome. During this time where you're gaining life experience, and I think there's a lot of us that are that way, that when you hit 40, you're able to look back on some things and you have very different perspective than you would have in your 20s, that's for sure. During that time where you're pursuing your professional life, and did you have these stories in your mind all along, or was this just something that started building in you?
No, I didn't really have any stories in mind, but actually, there's an interesting observation in there that when I was starting technology companies, I was always the one that would write the business plan, and a business plan for a new technology company is like 100-page book where you describe all these fantastic technologies and how they'll impact people's lives in the future. And so, when you're talking a new technology business plan, it's a lot like a science fiction novel. It's all about the future. It's all about people's lives and how it will, the impacts it'll have. And you in a way, you're writing like a piece of science fiction work. And so there's a lot of, I worked in weather prediction systems. I worked in a field called haptics, which is human-computer interface. I worked, genomics and proteomics software. So it's a whole list of things. So I had a lot of this stuff in mind, and I think I use a lot of that background when I'm writing about technology. I've got kind of that background allows me to look into things in a little bit more depth.
Yeah. Where did the idea for the Atopia Chronicles come from?
Atopia is that came from my work and working in something called human machine interfaces. So every way that you interact with a machine, you've got some type of device. You've either got a screen which is giving you information to your eyes, or you got a keyboard and a mouse where you're giving direct input of information from the human into the machine. And whenever I look at science fiction, sort of my motivation for Atopia was whenever I looked at science fiction, like you'd see people flying around in these faster than light spaceships on Star Trek, or or almost any science fiction thing where they've got these really amazing transporter technology, whatever in it, but they're still typing on keyboards and punching buttons. And I said, there is no way that you're going to have all this incredibly advanced technology without having some, advancement in the field of the way that we interface and interact with machines. And so Atopia, actually, and it sounds kind of dry and not very much fun, but I sat back and I thought about what the future of the way that we'd interact with machines would be and how we would merge with machines. And I sat down and wrote a series of what started off as a series of short stories that explored some of the potential for some of these ideas and the obviously the what happens to the characters, the bad side of it, and then that actually coalesced into a full novel. So if you read those books, there's some people that just don't understand what the sort of background is, and there's some people that read it and think, my God, this is an interesting look into the future of how we're going to merge with machines, and so that was really the impetus for that novel.
Did you have an idea, like as you started sketching out and going through that what if process and saying, what if in the future this happens and that happens? Did some characters begin to come alive to you as you started fleshing out these ideas?
Yeah, a little bit, although I have to say that my books are primarily, idea-driven, premise-driven, and I think my characters are getting better now that I've been a writer for, going on 5 years. I've gone back and started to study the craft of writing and the idea of the characters and building them into kind of real people. I think my first book and my first books, the characters are pretty much paper thin. They're pretty much entirely driven by the premise, and people who enjoy it in science fiction, you get a little bit of a get out of jail free card in that if you have really strong ideas, people are willing to overlook the fact that you can barely write and your characters are paper thin. And that's an interesting way to be able to sort of get into writing it as you evolve more. Like in Atopia, I had probably about two incredible ideas per page, and I think now I would use one of those incredible ideas to write an entire novel. So Atopia is just dripping with complexity, and I think it happens to a lot of first-time authors. You've got all this time and space of all these ideas, and you kind of cram them into one novel, and and so that first novel tends to be incredibly dense and incredibly, a lot of stuff in there. And I think Atopia both suffers from and benefits from that.
Well, if you could go back today and rewrite Atopia, how do you think you would approach it differently?
Oh my God, it's interesting.
And I know that's a very unfair question to ask a writer, but
it's interesting because I talked to quite a lot of the authors in the space. Michael Hopf in the sort of the disaster books, and Darren Wearmouth, Colin Barnes in England, and there's a lot of sort of contemporary. In fact, pretty much everybody in the sort of the bestseller lists. I have conversations that I've started with people, and the interesting thing is I was talking with Darren over the weekend, and he had exactly the same thing with his first book. Is you want to go back and rewrite your first book because you look at it, you go, this sucks. Like the characters are terrible, the writing is terrible, and so if I've thought about it a lot. If I went back and rewrote Atopia, I think I would rewrite it in third person as opposed to first. I think I'd cut out like the first two stories and then create a character arc narrative instead of just a sort of a series of connected stories that's wrapped all together in one bigger book. But if I had the time and the effort, I think I would go back and do it. But I think you need to resist the urge to go back and rewrite a book. Because on the other hand, there are a lot of people that really, really love that book, as is. So I don't want to go and spoil their experience either.
Well, and that was going to be my follow-up, is that as authors, I think everyone I've ever talked to, we would all love to go back and especially rewrite that first book because we've learned so much after that. But Atopia has obviously found an audience, people that love that book. So what about the book what about it really resonates with people that you can tell?
Well, I think it's really the premise or the ideas in there. When I wrote Atopia, I actually hadn't read any science fiction in probably a decade or something, and when I got into it, I purposely didn't go and read anything else. I said I'm just going to write a book about my ideas and never really care what anybody else has written. And so it really benefits from. It's not like anything else, but it also suffers from. It's not like anything else. Like it doesn't have that the character driven narrative with the same structure that you'll see. It's a little bit of an experimental. If you were a regular writer, it would be a piece of experimental fiction. But being as I didn't really know how fiction should have properly been structured, it was just something that came out. And that being said, it is structured. It builds towards a climax, and all the story threads come together. I mean, it is a clever piece of work. It's just it's not structured in the same way that other works are, and it's really the ideas inside of it. My view of how humans and machines would merge, and how we would have things like distributed consciousness, and how information processing would be handled in the brain and in the machine outside, and how we would interact with the machines, and all these ideas. If people read it and they're thinking about those kind of things, they think people have a very strong reaction, like, oh my God, this is how the future is going to be, kind of thing. Yeah. And I think that's when people like it, that's the kind of reaction. People don't like it, they go, what the heck is going on here? They have no idea what's happening. So
do you get feedback like that from people that are like, oh my God, this is where the world is going, and what do we do to prevent these types of things? Do you get feedback like that from readers?
Yeah, I get emails from people from time to time saying, this is insanely brilliant, and which is really nice. That being said, I mean, obviously it's built off a lot of other work, and there's a huge field of information out there that I kind of derived a lot of it from and put it together. So yeah, I do get. Do they say that they don't want to have this happen? Well, I think like any sort of forward-looking book, you have sort of. As it describes the technology, it describes all these great ways you can use it, and then obviously somebody abuses it, and then ends up with this really negative thing. And I think, the technology isn't evil. It's just the way that humans can wrap themselves up in it, which there can be some pitfalls. So I don't really have people saying, I don't want the future to be like this. It's not dystopian in that it has like a really negative worldview. It describes. Really, what it describes is like the ultimate in virtual reality. If you had an unlimited number of synthetic universes that were perfectly integrated into your senses, what could happen? And it's sort of a what if, set of books with some characters in it.
Right. Do you feel like that readers of science fiction and speculative fiction place some sort of extra responsibility on writers in this genre to to sort of fix these types of problems?
To fix them.
Yeah, I've there seems like this genre really asks some of the hard questions about where society's going and things like that. And do you feel like readers, expect us not only to look into the future, but to have the answers for that?
Oh no, I don't think I no, I've never had that kind
No,
of I've never had that kind of feeling. I mean, I think your job, my job primarily is to entertain and to maybe to bring some possibilities to light that people might not have thought of before. And speculative fiction, science fiction has a long history of how many scientists and engineers grew up as little kids reading Asimov and then became rocket scientists and actually launched space missions and Elon Musk, I'm sure, was reading all about
exactly.
Robinson Crusoe on Mars, and then now he's creating a Mars so there's sort of a positive feedback cycle where I think science fiction actually can precede and or even influence the way that real technology ends up going in the future. Do we have a responsibility? I don't think we have a responsibility. I mean, we're primarily entertainers. There is a slightly serious. I don't know if I describe it as a responsibility, but I mean, I guess you could, but that would also be a little bit smacking of hubris, a little bit.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
as a writer, you're trying to entertain, you're trying to make a living, you're trying to do, you're trying to have a serious dialogue with your fans, but I also wouldn't overstep the importance of kind of what I'm doing, unless you're Neil Gaiman or something, then
Right.
maybe you might have some type of responsibility to, but I don't think that he would think that either. So
Right. I think our main responsibility is to be a good storyteller,
yeah,
and then anything better than that comes out of that, I think is gravy. But
yeah. I have no illusions of trying to be Dostoevsky or something.
uh, what about Dystopia Chronicles? That obviously a sequel to the Atopia Chronicles.
Yeah, there's a sequel, and actually, I was really with that. I kind of switched into more storytelling mode, and it's gotten really good reviews, but it hasn't sold nearly as well as Atopia. And I don't know, there's a lot of probably reasons behind that, but yeah, that's a sequel to it. I'm making a trilogy out of Atopia, where I actually have the whole endpoint already mapped out. But it's going to end up in sort of the many universes sort of model. It's hard not it's hard not to fall into the sort of the using any of the sort of the tried and true and overused tropes in science fiction, so I think there's going to be some careful thinking before I finish off that trilogy. But yeah, Dystopia is sort of the Empire Strikes Back version, part um, of that trilogy.
Yeah. Now, does it continue the same storyline as Atopia?
Yeah, it actually continues the same. It continues the same storyline. And again, that one actually for Atopia was an exploration. Atopia was based on this island, sort of like a little Silicon Valley on this floating island, like a floating ship kind of thing, very big one, off the coast of California, where they were building this sort of wonderland of new virtual reality technologies. Whereas Dystopia actually took the reader into America on a sort of road trip through America in about the year 2075 ish. Um, and in that, I was sort of highlighting you had all this virtual reality technology on Atopia, but then I actually did a long job of figuring out what the state of technological evolution would be, and also political and a whole bunch of other stuff, and created sort of an entire world of 2070, and then had the reader sort of go through it on kind of a road trip, and that was. And then obviously at the same time as continuing the evolution of the story. So the Atopia happens really on the island of Atopia, and Dystopia is heading through the sort of slightly confusing and messed up America in about 50 or 60 years from now. That's kind of where I was trying to go with it.
The covers of both of those books are fantastic. But the very different tone in the two books. I'm assuming that that's on purpose, and that you're setting up the tone for the trilogy in Atopia with the uh, almost utopian type setting, and then Dystopia where it's obviously falling apart and there's some cataclysm there.
There is a cataclysm, yes. Yeah. And so actually the third book in the series is going to be called Utopia. So it'll be Atopia, Dystopia, and Utopia, where there will be a happy ending. Or, yeah. If not a happy ending, there will be a coming together and a realization of what's actually happening. So it'll wrap everything together. I was kind of like going in a color thing. The first one was kind of a blue cover with the ocean and the island of Atopia, and the second one is cataclysmic red. And then the third one is going to be, I'm imagining kind of leaves and green and Utopia sort of pasted over the front of it.
Nice. Now, both
Yeah.
of those books were published this year, is that right?
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing, Atopia, actually, I published in August of 2012.
Okay.
And then it was re-released in January 2014 by 47
Gotcha.
North Publishing. So 47 North took over the book and then republished it this year.
Okay. Uh, what was your reasoning for wanting to self-publish Atopia in the beginning?
Well, just out of necessity. I mean, I wrote the book in 2010, really. 2009, 2010 was when I wrote it, and then it sat on a shelf for about a year and a half or something. Not really sure what to do with it. During that time, I had some friends who were authors, and my sister lives in New York, and she knew the editor at Random House, Penguin Random House, and blah blah blah. And so I didn't really understand anything about what to do with the book at that point. So I went and queried a bunch of agents and probably sent off 100, 150 query letters and talked to agents and publishers. And the book itself was 140,000 words, which is big for, which is big.
Yeah.
It's whatever, 600 something pages.
Right.
And basically everybody came back and said, it's unpublishable. It's too big. It's too complicated. Nobody will get their head around it. Blah, blah, blah. And then actually, during that time, interestingly, I met Hugh Howey, and I actually put a couple of my short stories up on at the beginning of 2012. I was sort of testing the water, seeing how this Amazon KDP thing worked. And I started talking with Hugh Howey, and I actually met him in New York when we were both. I was traveling around for work, and he was still working in a bookstore at the time. And I met him. He actually lived in Charlotte. Well, he came from Charlotte, which is like my family's hometown. So we'd actually chatted, and we met in New York, and a couple of times when he'd been there for some work, and it was just then that everything sort of took off with Hugh. And then I decided to put Atopia up on there and follow Hugh's path, and it all sort of took off from there.
What was that feeling like? You said earlier that you took a year sabbatical to write your book, and you obviously felt like that you had a premise that you wanted to explore, and something that meant something to you, and then to start sending out those query letters and to be told that no one will ever get their head around it. What's that feeling like?
I mean, it sounds cliche now because you've got so many. I can't tell you all the stories I read on. Nobody wanted my book and it was rejected, and then I self-published it and it sold 1 million copies. Not, I didn't sell 1 million, but it sold quite a few. How does it feel at the time? Well, it's very disheartening. It's all the things you would imagine. I mean, you don't even know what to do with it. At that point, it just seems like publishing a book. It seems like it has a feeling of, like the same likelihood as me, going and landing on the moon and walking around on the moon's surface. It like seems so distant. And then when I discovered the idea of self-publishing, and then talked to Hugh way back when, and then put the thing up there, and then I think when I put Atopia up, and then Hugh gave it a push, and I did like some promotions on it, it went up into like the #1 spot on Amazon Science Fiction overnight, and that was an amazing experience. So
Yeah.
It was, it went from one extreme to the other almost overnight.
Wow. So you found an audience pretty quickly, huh? Once you kind of got on that path and
Yeah, I mean, I think I come from the business world, and I don't believe that there's any one path to, success. I think it's a mixture of being in the right place at the right time and having the right type of thing. And I think with, I think I managed to ride kind of a wave back in 2012 of sort of the first self-published, the beginning of the stigma of self-publishing started to go away then, or was
right.
starting, was just, nowadays we talk self-publishing, it's almost completely gone. And there's actually kind of a reverse thing where people think, traditional publishing almost a stigma to it to some people. Um, but way back then, in those days, 2 years ago, it wasn't quite the same case. And I think I benefited from sort of there was a kind of a first wave of self-publishing, and then I think in 2012 when I got on board, I think there was another wave that kind of another sort of new batch of authors that weren't selling millions of copies, but we're kind of the mid-listers of the self-publishing world. You can earn a pretty good living, and have a good audience, and you don't need to be a household name.
Right. There's been kind of this thing that's happened where indie publishing is kind of like indie music, where um, you almost have this stigma of being the pop star that's on a major label and is the bubblegum top 40 artist, whereas all the cool kids are indie musicians and that sort of thing. And publishing is kind of going through sort of that, which is kind of odd to watch, but I'm very grateful for.
Yeah.
But tell me about Cyberstorm.
Yeah, so that was my that was my second book, or my third book. It's sort of separate than the Atopia. In that one, I'd spent the last couple of years working in the cybersecurity field. So anti-hacking, working with like Fortune 500 companies, that sort of thing. I mean, electrical engineering is a background, so I had some knowledge in that field. And the inspiration for Cyberstorm was really that when I go to all these cybersecurity conferences, and I used to go to Washington and do lectures or give some talks to the DHS and whatever about the state of security kind of thing. There's such a big disconnect. There's the cybersecurity professionals, and they look at it and go, any system anywhere can be hacked into, and all the critical infrastructure is hanging on a shoestring, not a shoestring, but it's so easy to hack into this stuff. Like I could literally teach my grandmother how to hack into something using online, free tools, and you can
Right.
get into power stations and whatever. Like it's so easy to do, but the public doesn't have that same perception. And also when you talk to the public about a cyber war, they think of something kind of, it's like the war on obesity. It's almost like this metaphorical kind of quality to it. And so I wanted to write Cyberstorm to illustrate in a show don't tell kind of way exactly what would happen if you had a major cyber event in a large city. And so I picked New York because New York gets beat up in every dystopian,
Right.
every disaster in the world hits New York first. So I picked New York, and my sister lived there, and I said, okay, here's what happens when you have this giant city. Like, New York, I think, needs to have, I don't know how many million eggs per day shipped into it. And, like it doesn't survive by itself. If you stop the logistics network going into a large city and you stop the transportation networks and everything else, um, there was sort of famous quote when I was in Washington, actually listening to one of these talks. One of the top cybersecurity experts said, if you cut off all the supplies going into a major, a mega city like New York, you got about 20 to 30 days before cannibalism will set in. So
Mm.
that was something that I tried to illustrate in Cyberstorm.
So is it set in present day New York?
Yeah, it's present day. It actually starts on Christmas Day, which is next week. So hopefully that won't happen this year.
Let's hope not. uh, you have close to 4,000 reviews on Cyberstorm.
Yeah,
That book has obviously found an audience.
yeah.
Yeah. How long did it take for that book to really gain legs and find an audience of its own?
When I put it up, it kind of hovered around the 500 mark, and then it shot up into the top 100. Actually, I went and put it as a 99. I have kind of, I think when you put a new book out, it needs to find kind of an audience, unless you're going for the same audience that have always read your stuff. And so if I put a new book out, I like to put it up for like 99 cents for a month or two. And during that time, a lot of people will read it, and then there's a certain group of people that really kind of cottoned on to Cyberstorm, and once they start telling their friends, and their friends tell their friends, the book sort of it gained a momentum, and I put it up to a regular price of $2.99 or $3.99, and then it really shot up in the rankings maybe 2 or 3 months after I put it out.
Now, you said something interesting, and it's something that I've often wondered about. Uh, you said that each book has its own audience. Do you find that is true for, well, let me ask this way. Do you have a core audience that you think will follow everything that you do? And then how much of when you publish a new book does it have to find a completely new audience of its own?
Yeah, I don't have a good answer for that. I think there's probably a few people that will buy any book of mine, but
Right.
they probably number 1,000 or something. Uh, more than that. I think that each book needs to find its own audience for me. I mean, I'm not like Lee Childs or like you writing the same type of thing and over and over again.
Right.
It's it's kind of the same sort of thing, but I think each one is slightly different. And I'm also sort of experimenting with Atopia was more sort of hard science fiction, almost, broaching fantasy. It's not fantasy, but it's just a little bit, some of the stuff in it seems like it would be. Whereas Cyberstorm is more apocalyptic, straight up apocalyptic fiction with a heavy dose of discussion around information security and cyber terrorism and all that sort of stuff. And my new novel, Darknet, which is coming out now, is kind of a straight up thriller, fugitive meets sort of boiler room sort of thing. And I'm going back to the straight up apocalyptic scenario or dystopian stuff in my next book after that, called Nomad. So they're all kind of in the same kind of wheelhouse, but they're a little bit different, and depending on what kind of a mood people are in there. I find readers tend to go through these sort of binge eating phases where they'll go through all apocalyptic fiction or all cyberpunk or something. So yeah, I see those as sort of vertical silos, and when people sort of are munching through everything in that category, they'll come through one of my books. But I don't. It's fairly rare that they'll sort of go sideways and go through all of your books unless you really hit a nerve.
Have you gotten any feedback on Cyberstorm from people that questioned you about how you know these things? did did anybody like um, Mr. Mather, you're predicting things that you shouldn't know about?
No. I
No.
mean, the interesting thing is actually professionally, and I'm not as much in touch now, but back then I was actually in touch with, the head of cybersecurity for the DHS, and I think I thanked quite a few of them at the beginning of my novel, because I actually went and talked to like the head of cyber terrorism for NATO, and the head of the cyber for the DA, the Department of Homeland Security, and I had some good friends at the McCord Air Force Base in just outside of Seattle that head up the cyber units for the Air Force, and I talked to them all about it, and actually, they gave me a bunch of scenarios and things that I actually used in Cyberstorm. So yeah, Cyberstorm is interesting because it actually is drawn from real people with real scenarios, like this, the sort of the warfare exercise sort of stuff. Some of the stuff is brought from what they're actually looking at, and scenarios that they're actually, it really comes from there. And I think that's why it actually has sort of that realistic feel to it.
it probably is very immediate, because, like you said, that we really do live in a precarious position where when if these things start breaking down, things kind of go to hell quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to bang on that drum too much. The problem you have now is there's no reversion to previous systems. Like if you know if the logistics system breaks down, or you go into Whole Foods to go and buy something, and the cash register stopped working, you can't start scribbling down who got what. There's no stock system in the background for keeping track of things, and it used to be that companies would they would operate local warehouses in a city. So they would ship everything into the city. You would have these local warehouses next to the stores where everything was, and then people would go and get stuff as they needed it. Now you have this just-in-time system where and I have friends that do logistics for a living. They've gotten rid of the 10 local warehouses, and they have one warehouse out in the middle of absolutely nowhere, and whatever, up in the mountains or something, that is the shortest travel route between all of these different cities, and they put all the stock into there, and then it gets sent out, and. But if you interrupt that logistics supply, now the cities don't have any stock anymore. The stock is in the middle of nowhere, miles from
Right.
anything. So if you interrupt that system, it's just like a house of cards. There's no, you can't go back to scribbling things on pieces of paper or whatever. There's no reversion to the previous. It's just like there's no. If cars break down, there's not. We used to have, I think, like 10 times as many horses. And this is kind of a dumb example, but we used to have 10 times as many horses. When they brought in cars, they actually had to kill off all the horses. In the beginning of the 20th century. So now if cars stop working, you don't have any horses around anymore. You can't just say, oh, we'll go back to using horses. There are no horses. You
Right.
don't have the previous stuff is not around anymore. There's no reversion.
Well, the that book has obviously found an audience, and 20th Century Fox has acquired the film rights for it. Is that
Yeah,
right?
yeah, that was a year and a half ago now. The 20th Century Fox came in, and right when it shot up the charts on Amazon, I hired a film agent, and 20th Century Fox came in and bought the film rights to it. But I don't know what they're doing with it. To begin with, they hired a writer from House of Cards who was involved in writing the screenplay, and I think it's kind of sitting in that limbo land right now. I think the number, something like maybe once a book gets optioned as option for film, the odds are somewhere between 1 in 10 and 1 in 100 that it will get put into a big budget film. Because the option costs X amount of dollars, but to build a film costs you know
Oh, sure.
200x. So
Right.
it's, or 500x or whatever it is. So I think they buy a lot of options, and they get the script, and then they kind of, I think Cyberstorm, Hollywood tends to make movies in bunches, so
Right.
when you had, Deep Impact and the Asteroid movies, there were like 4 of them that came out at the same time. And I think there will probably be a spate of cyber terrorism. Well, there already is a lot of, cyber, every movie that comes out now that's a thriller has a cyber component to it, inevitably. But I think there might be some sort of large-scale cyber disaster movies in a couple of years, and maybe Cyberstorm will be one of them.
I hope so. That's going to be a fantastic story to see on the screen. Um, Going through that process of having a film optioned, um, and then as you continue writing, does that affect your writing from here out? Do you think cinematically when you write, or did you already?
Yeah,
Is that something that goes through your mind for
it
future
does.
projects?
I mean, it does. I think we, as a non-professionally trained writer, not going through writing school and all that sort of thing, I think we tend to we tend to imagine things in terms of film scripts. And it's only actually recently I've gone and as I've started to become a writer, holding my hands up, quote unquote, I've gone and read, all about the hero's journey and the 3 act structure and all that sort of stuff. And now actually that I understand how all that stuff is structured, when I watch movies or I read books, especially when I watch movies, actually, you can say, oh, look, there's the turn at the end of Act One, and here's the midpoint bomb. And you can almost time it by what minute you are in the movie of exactly when these events happen.
Yes.
And so you've been kind of unconsciously programmed that this is how stories work. And for better or for worse, people, I think, have been conditioned to expect stories in this manner. And so now I've started to produce stories more in that manner, again, for better or for worse. And so, yeah, you are influenced by that. And ultimately, I think we all sort of imagine, when we imagine a storyline, we imagine it as a movie in our heads, when we imagine it as a Hollywood movie. And so it all kind of suffers from that. But some of the movies that I enjoy the most don't exactly adhere. You can still fit in that format and not have it be formulaic. So I think there's sort of a push and pull a little bit there. But yeah, inevitably, I do feel that, you get, once you have a success like that, then you want to continue to see that kind of success. And so you start to imitate, and imitation's not a bad thing. Like Microsoft did pretty good imitating everybody else and making a lot of money. So
It's worked pretty good for them.
it's the sincerest form of flattery, right? I don't think it's a bad. So I think, yeah, there's a lot of things come into play. I mean, I'm trying to evolve as an artist, but you inevitably get influenced by all that sort of stuff.
Sure. Now, you are a full-time writer now, is that right?
Yeah, yeah. I have to take care of my dogs.
So what's a writing day for you like?
Um, well, there's there's a couple of different modes. I tend to only get involved in one project at a time, just because my brain seems to be able to, or best handles things when it does one thing at a time, as probably many people. But so there's sort of the plotting phase, and then there's the writing phase, and then there's the editing phase. When I'm in writing mode, I try to get up as early as I can, but ideally I want to get up at 5 a.m. and get writing by 6 o'clock in the morning or something. But it's also influenced. Like, you need to. When I'm in writing mode, you need to have your brain as clear as possible. So I try to not, alcohol clouds my brain. So I try to not drink, to kind of stay off things like alcohol or just things that are going to be clouding yourself. So I try to also, eat a healthy diet, try to get like 7 or 8 hours of sleep before I'm writing. It's like, I feel like, well, actually, when I'm in writing mode, I feel like I'm running a marathon. Like you're like, every day you get up and you got to keep chipping away at it. And you got to keep your motivation high. You've got to keep your energy high. You got to keep your brain clear. And so it's actually a good analogy. When I'm in writing mode, like, I keep like a clean brain, body, mind, and I'm writing, and but I'll write a book in, 2 months or something. And I just try to devote everything to that. And I'll be up early, and kind of run through it. When I'm in plotting mode, that's more, that's more creative mode. And then I'm, out chatting and, maybe having drinks at night and chatting with people about ideas. And that's more of the creative juices kind of coming out kind of thing.
Right.
And that can take a good, 2 months when I'm writing a book. Fleshing out the characters, the plot, the technology, the premise, making everything, all that sort of stuff. And so that's sort of the creative part, and the writing is really sort of almost a mechanical marathon running thing. And then when I get into the editing, that's a whole different process. And again, there I'm trying to, in that it's more managing. I have like a couple of hundred beta readers that volunteered to read my books. I've got professional editors that I engage, and so there it's more setting the information out and then trying to make sense of this huge flood of information that comes at me to try and come up with strategies for re-editing and improving a product, I guess.
Sure.
So
How do you manage 200 beta readers? That has to be a ton of suggestions that come in.
Yeah, well, I tell you what, when, there's a couple of different phases. There's sort of a very first phase where I kind of, when I do editing, I have like a first very high level developmental thing where I'll work with a professional editor and get some sort of high level comments in. And then I'll go on kind of a second stage where I'll send it out to a couple, let's say 200 beta readers. my experience is typically about half the people won't have the time to read it for whatever, even no matter how enthusiastic they are, about half people won't be able to read it for whatever reason. And also, reading a book in a non-finished state is challenging in its own ways.
Right.
And so, if I get like feedback from maybe 100 people, it does sound mind-boggling. But the interesting thing is, you'll find that if they give you people give you maybe 10 or 15 comments on the book, and I've got a list of questions actually, and I do it in like a Survey Monkey or another tool that helps streamline that. But people will tend to, like, if I get feedback from 100 people, like the number one comment, 65 of them will make exactly the same comment. And then the next comment, like 40 of them will make the same comment. And so what happens for the first 5 or 10 people that come in, I kind of write down all this stuff. But then as more comments come in, I instead of writing down the details, I just put scratches beside which particular thing. And then when I get into the rewriting process, I actually start off with, okay, what did 65 people say? And I'll put the most effort into making that fixed. And then I'll go and look at what 40 people said, and then what 30 people, and then trailing off to the smaller ones. And by the end of the process, you kind of lose energy, and the smaller ones, you can decide whether you think it's important, or do I like that or not like it. But if 65% of your readers say you need to change this, you pretty much need to change it.
Yeah. Well, that was going to be my next question, was do you ever have a situation where you just completely disagree with everyone and say, no, I wrote this because it was important, and I stand by it?
Yeah, a little bit. There's sometimes not usually the big points, but yeah, there are times where I'll disagree with an editor for sure. I mean, at the end of the day, you're the one. This is your thing, right? So you're the decider. Borrow that expression from GW.
Yeah.
But you have to decide what you want to create, right? So. Yeah, and that's a hard process. You get all this feedback from people, you get all this information, and at a certain day you're sitting there with 50 pages of comments and feedback, and they're staring at this manuscript, and you gotta go, well, what do you want to do with this thing? And that's a difficult process.
Yeah. What do you think, or what do you see coming down the line, Matthew, in terms of publishing and the state of self-publishing? You come from an interesting background of very forward-looking industry, and then coming into an industry that is going through a massive upheaval. Do you see any parallels with publishing and self-publishing and kind of the way things are changing?
Yeah, well, I think we've kind of went from to draw some long analogies or parallels. When the printing press was introduced in whatever, when Gutenberg brought this newfangled machine out, he put a lot of scribes out of business, and they said it's going to change, change the nature of books. And at the time, there was a hegemony of organizations and people that were in charge, and it splintered into these, smaller printing houses, and but over time, it again grew into sort of a cabal of people that were sort of ruling the industry. And I think publishing, hit that digital wall that that music had hit and that everybody else had hit in the past couple of years. And even though they knew it was coming, it took everybody by surprise. And how could that happen? Blah, blah, blah. But it's happened now, and I think it's sort of, music. My sister's in the music business, and it's forever changed the music business now. You don't have the big albums that sell into the stores and the publishers. That whole business is kind of gone, and it's moved into people are making most of their money now through performance, or the biggest chunk of stuff is coming through live performance, which is actually better for indie artists because that's and they're able to. Indie artists now are able to make more money. Or make a comparable kind of, not comparable, but they're on a little bit more of equal footing. That they're going to make a lot more money from doing live performance, and then they're able to sell stuff online by using their live performance time, push everything. And so, I think there's sort of been a structural change in the music business that I think that's going to end up being long term, and I think something like the same thing is going to happen in the book business, but I do think, we've got this push where now you've got all these, people can self-publish and people are making good living off and you can be independent. But I don't think it's going to be that long before a new hegemony comes in and there's going to be a new set of power players. And although Amazon is being very generous to everybody now, giving a 70% revenue split, you're already starting to see it. And I predicted it last year where Amazon's going to get a dominant position, get everybody on board with them, and then start to, whenever this new power structure sort of boils down, they're always going to squeeze the little guy. Like the big guy's going to squeeze the little guy, and it's not because they're evil. It's just that it's a corporation. They're there to make money. They've got shareholders that want profit, and so they need to try and generate as much profit as possible. Like whenever we have these discussions, people say publishers are evil. I don't think they're evil. They're just running a business according to certain guidelines, and they've got shareholders, and that's what they're trying to do. They're running a business. It's just that you end up being on the short stick of it. So I think that self-published authors and digital stuff are going to end up getting the short stick, again by someone. Maybe not next year, but 5 years from now, you're already starting to see it with this Kindle Unlimited, thing, and Kindle rewarding the highest paying authors in their sort of their select program and all this sort of stuff. So now they're already starting to sort of unfairly, quote unquote, sort of reward the higher earning or the higher producing authors. So I think that's just going to, and you're going to start to see platforms created by independent authors bunching together. But inevitably in a couple of years, a couple of those platforms are going to kind of distill outwards, and they're going to end up, having better terms for their central authors. And there's going to be certain platforms that are created, and it's going to end up being some sort of again, the little guy's going to get squeezed in a few years. So everybody out there, I think you really need to take advantage of this sort of in between phase, because it doesn't happen very often.
Yeah, and as always, the authors and the indie guys have to remain nimble and ready to go where the innovation is happening.
Yeah, I mean, and all that being said, like I was reading something yesterday about Mark Twain when he put out Tom Sawyer. Mark Twain been doing a different type of thing before he put out Tom Sawyer. Tom Sawyer was viewed as sort of like this kid's book, but then again, it had all these dark themes. It was about racism and had
Right.
all this weird stuff in it. And the publishers kind of went, "This isn't going to sell." Like now you look at it and go, "It's Mark. It's Tom Sawyer. He's one of the most iconic books of all time." But at the time, he said, "Well, fine. I'm going to go out. I'm going to hire a bunch of door-to-door salesmen, and they're going to go out with these advanced copies of it, and they're going to go door-to-door and sell it to schools, sell it to people, sell it to libraries." And so Mark Twain actually used a businessman to help him fund doing this non-standard publishing model of using direct selling of this book and whatever. So even Mark Twain, even 50 years ago, had to use an out-of-the-box thinking, fresh way to put out a book that ended up becoming an icon of, of all books ever published. And so at no point, you look back in time and think, oh, they had it so much easier or so much different. In every age, at every time, I think authors have had to think out of the box and figure out ways to get to readers and figure out any way they can to try and get attention and to try and get out there. And so, I think we've just got to continue doing the same thing in the new world that we're in.
That's right, and we've got to. It's authors are never in a position now where you can just ignore your audience. You've got to make those relationships and cultivate that, and stay with those faithful readers for sure.
Yeah, and you gotta, like I said, you just gotta keep thinking of ways. What tools are available now that I could use to try and get out there to the readers, and yeah, you gotta use everything you can at your disposal and then some, and just be creative. That's all. Yeah. And that's the way it always was and the way it always will be. And I feel that's like I'm ending a sermon there.
Well, speaking of that, Matthew, where can people find you and connect with you?
So I got a blog on MatthewMather.com. Most of my interaction is done over Facebook. So author Matthew Mather on Facebook. You can find me on there, posting up holiday pictures and talking about my books and stuff like that. And then on all my books are published on Amazon, so you can find them there.
Excellent. And I'll put links to all of those in the show notes. When can we expect a new release from you?
I'm actually going to put my new book, Darknet, up for pre-order tomorrow.
Awesome.
So Darknet it's actually a really fun romp through the sort of the back alleys of Wall Street and the inner workings of financial companies and the rise of this, I don't want to give away too much, but something, a big cyber threat comes up and it's one guy. It's kind of like The Fugitive, a man on the run type of story as he gets embroiled in this investigation and then everything spins out of control. And a lot of themes of, autonomous corporations and cryptocurrencies and all sorts of stuff. It's kind of, I think it's a good time. So that's good. That's going to be going up on tomorrow. I'll have it on Amazon.
Awesome. Well, I will include a link to that, a show note. Matthew Mather, thank you for taking time out to come on the show. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I wish you continued success.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me.